He held tight to the leash of his loyal companion, only to hear no animals allowed, until the airline CEO bent down and said, "Bring your partner aboard." The scarred hands of Robert Mercer trembled slightly as he adjusted the service vest on Sadie's muscular shoulders. 72 years had weathered his face like tanned leather, but 28 years in the Air Force had kept his spine ramrod straight. "Just another mission, girl," he whispered, fingers finding comfort in the familiar coarse fur of the German shepherd, who had become his lifeline since the nightmares began. The terminal's vast ceiling arched overhead, a cavernous space that seemed to amplify every announcement, every rolling suitcase, every thundering heartbeat. Sadie pressed against his leg, her warm presence steady as they navigated the crowded terminal. The dog's alert eyes scanned the surroundings, trained to anticipate his needs before he recognized them himself. Robert clutched the service animal documentation in his left hand, papers creased from nervous folding and unfolding. 3 years together, and still each public outing felt like a battlefield assessment. "Stay calm. We've done this before. She keeps me grounded when the world starts spinning." The dog's tags clinked softly against her collar, a gentle metronome counting their steps toward gate B-17. Morning light slanted through massive windows, casting long shadows across polished floors as Robert approached the counter. Travelers rushed past, a blur of motion and sound that sometimes triggered the tightness in his chest. Sadie sensed it immediately, pressing her weight more firmly against his leg. The boarding pass trembled between his fingers as he extended it toward the gate agent, a young woman with hair pulled into a severe bun. He noticed her eyes drift downward, lingering on Sadie before returning to his face with a flash of something that made his stomach clench. "Good morning," Robert said, voice pitched, low and steady, the way he'd spoken to nervous recruits decades ago. "Flight 2743, to Denver. I have my documentation for my service animal." He slid the paperwork forward, the edge catching on the counter's smooth surface. Sadie sat perfectly at attention, her service vest prominently displaying "Working Dog, Do Not Pet" in bold reflective letters. The tags on her collar caught the overhead light, flashing like distant aircraft signals through cloud cover. The gate agent's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see any note in your reservation about a service animal." Her voice carried the rehearsed politeness of someone preparing to say no. Robert felt a familiar pressure building behind his sternum, the precursor to the racing thoughts that only Sadie's presence could quell. The dog sensed his tension, pressing her muzzle against his hand. "Breathe. Just breathe. She's doing her job, same as you always did." "The documentation is complete," Robert explained, tapping the papers with a weathered finger. "Sadie is trained to assist with my PTSD. We've flown your airline before, without issue." He reached inside his jacket, retrieving a small leather wallet. The VAID card slid out, alongside a faded photograph of a younger man in uniform standing beside an aircraft. The woman glanced at the documents, her lips pursing into a thin line that Robert had come to recognize as bureaucratic indecision. Around them, the gate area hummed with activity. A child pointed at Sadie, tugging her mother's sleeve, until she was hushed. Robert felt the weight of eyes upon him, the silent judgment of travelers who saw only an old man holding up the line. Sweat beaded at his hairline, despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. Sadie remained motionless, except for her eyes, which never left his face, reading his distress in micro-expressions no human could detect. "I need to consult with my supervisor," the agent finally said, reaching for a phone beneath the counter. "Our policy regarding service animals has recently changed." Her voice dropped as she spoke into the receiver, turned slightly away as if to prevent him from hearing. Robert's fingers found the edge of Sadie's vest, gripping the familiar fabric. "Don't let the darkness come. Not here. Not now." The dog responded by leaning harder against his leg, her steady presence anchoring him to the present when memories threatened to drag him under. Minutes stretched like hours, as Robert stood at the counter, acutely aware of the growing line behind him. The murmurs began, the soft rustle of impatience from those whose journeys were momentarily delayed by his predicament. Sadie's ears twitched, registering changes in the ambient sound that might affect her handler. A supervisor approached. a man with a clipboard and an expression that Robert recognized from countless military briefings, the bearer of unwelcome news attempting to appear sympathetic while delivering it. "Mr. Mercer," the supervisor began, voice lowered as if sharing a confidence, "I understand your situation, but our new policy requires advanced notification for service animals on fully booked flights." He gestured vaguely toward the gate where passengers had begun to gather. "This flight is at capacity, and without the proper pre-boarding arrangement." The sentence hung unfinished, but the meaning was unmistakable. Robert felt the floor seem to tilt beneath him, the way it had during turbulence over unfriendly skies decades ago. Sadie pressed closer, her warm body the only thing preventing the world from spinning away. "Sir, I flew last month with no issues," Robert said, struggling to keep his voice, even as Sadie sensed his rising panic and moved to block his body from the pressing crowd. "She's not a pet. She's the only reason I can leave my house. The only reason the nightmares don't win." The words died in his throat as the supervisor exchanged glances with the gate agent. Robert's fingers tightened around the leash until his knuckles whitened, the leather warm and smooth from years of similar grips in similar moments of crisis. "I'm sorry, sir," the supervisor said with practiced finality, closing the binder with a soft snap that sounded to Robert like a cell door locking. "Policy's policy." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as mortar fire. Robert's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing beneath the weathered skin of his cheek as he absorbed the impact of the refusal. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, their conversations dropping to whispers as they pretended not to stare. A woman in a business suit frowned, leaning toward her companion to murmur something behind her hand. Sadie's ears flicked backward, registering the change in ambient sound as the gate area transformed from indifferent bustle to focused attention. "I can rebook you on tomorrow's flight," the supervisor offered, fingers already moving toward the keyboard. "We can make a notation about your service animal in the system." The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face, illuminating the corporate pin on his lapel, but not reaching his eyes. Robert felt his throat constrict, the familiar tightness that preceded an episode. Sadie immediately pressed her weight against his leg, performing her trained response to his rising anxiety. "Stay present. Focus on her. She needs you to be strong." 20 feet away, a young mother knelt to explain something to her wide-eyed daughter who pointed toward Sadie with unrestrained curiosity. "That dog helps the man feel better when he's scared," Robert heard her say, the simple truth of her words cutting through the administrative barrier erected before him. Sadie's tail gave a single dignified sweep across the polished floor, her training preventing the exuberant greeting she might offer in other circumstances. Robert gently stroked her head, drawing strength from the solid warmth beneath his palm. Memories surfaced unbidden. The first night Sadie had nudged him awake from a nightmare, her muzzle cool against his sweat-slicked face. The way she positioned herself between him and crowded doorways without command. The countless mornings her insistent paw had drawn him from the depths of depression, demanding their daily routine continue despite the darkness. "She saved my life more times than anyone knows." Robert's fingers found the small metal pin on his jacket, a habit formed over decades when facing adversity touched the wings that once carried him above clouds and danger. The distinct click of leather shoes against tile cut through the background noise of the terminal. A man in a tailored suit moved with purposeful strides through the concourse, trailing a compact rolling briefcase that tracked perfectly behind him. His silver hair was cropped close, his posture suggesting military bearing despite the civilian attire. Travelers instinctively parted before him, something in his demeanor commanding space without conscious effort. He slowed as he approached gate B-17, attention caught by the unusual tableau, an elderly man standing rigidly before the counter, a service dog at perfect attention beside him. Charles Whitfield had been CEO of Atlantic Airways for less than 18 months, but he'd spent 30 years in corporate aviation before that. His unannounced visits to terminals were legendary among staff, part of his hands-on management philosophy. He paused now, observing the interaction with narrowed eyes that missed nothing, the supervisor's defensive posture, the veteran's contained dignity, the service dog's alert vigilance. Most passengers didn't recognize him without the backdrop of press conferences or company media, allowing him to witness the true culture of his airline in unguarded moments like this. Robert sensed the shift in attention before he saw its source. Years of situational awareness had engraved that ability into his nervous system, the subtle change in surrounding energy. When someone significant enters a space, he turned slightly, keeping Sadie positioned protectively at his side. The CEO stood 15 paces away, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. For a moment, their eyes met across the terminal's sterile expanse, one man who had guided planes through hostile skies, another who now guided an airline through competitive markets. Something passed between them, a wordless recognition. Whitfield's attention was drawn to the small pin on Robert's jacket, not the obvious veteran designation, but a smaller, more obscure emblem partially hidden by the fold of fabric. His eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering across his features. The 47th Tactical Fighter Squadron, his father's unit. The same squadron patch he'd grown up seeing on his father's flight jacket, hanging in their hallway throughout his childhood. Without conscious decision, his hand moved to his own lapel, where an understated pin mirrored the one on Robert's jacket. Different era, same brotherhood of the sky. The boarding announcement echoed through the gate area, causing a ripple of movement among waiting passengers. Robert remained motionless, one hand on Sadie's harness, the other still gripping the rejected documentation. The dog looked up at him, then toward the jetway, trained to anticipate transitions and assist accordingly. The CEO observed as the supervisor stepped away from the counter, speaking quickly into a handheld radio, the gate agent already beginning to process boarding passes for first-class passengers. The veteran's rigid posture spoke volumes, the particular brand of dignified resignation familiar to those who have faced systemic barriers after sacrificing for systems they once defended. Charles Whitfield straightened his tie, a habitual gesture before making decisions that would ripple through his organization. 23,000 employees, 147 aircraft, billions in revenue, numbers that usually framed his daily choices. But some decisions transcended spreadsheets and quarterly projections. He thought of his father, long deceased, who would have recognized the quiet desperation in the older man's stance, the way he stood protective of the service animal that clearly protected him in return. The CEO's brisk stride resumed, carrying him directly toward the gate counter, where the supervisor was now avoiding eye contact with the stranded veteran. "Excuse me," Whitfield said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. The supervisor turned, annoyance flashing across his features before recognition dawned. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again as color drained from his face. The gate agent froze mid-scan, boarding pass suspended between trembling fingers. The CEO extended his hand not to them, but to Robert, who regarded it with the cautious assessment of a man who had learned the hard way that offered hands sometimes conceal hidden costs. "Charles Whitfield," he said simply, his grip firm as he shook Robert's weathered hand, "I'm the CEO of Atlantic Airways." The gate area fell silent, conversation suspended mid-sentence as recognition rippled through the crowd. The supervisor straightened his tie with nervous fingers, while the gate agent's posture transformed from bureaucratic certainty to anxious deference. Robert maintained his military bearing, decades of discipline evident in his unflinching gaze, though Sadie shifted slightly, her keen senses detecting the altered dynamic. "Robert Mercer," the veteran replied, his voice steady despite the tension evident in the tight line of his jaw. "United States Air Force, retired." He didn't elaborate on his rank or years of service. Those who needed to know would recognize the subtle indicators in his bearing, his restraint, the way he stood with feet precisely shoulder-width apart. Whitfield's eyes moved briefly to Sadie, noting the professional grade of her service vest, the perfect discipline in her posture, the alert intelligence in her eyes as she monitored her handler's stress levels. 47th Tactical, Whitfield said quietly, gesturing toward the partially concealed pin on Robert's jacket. "My father flew with them in Vietnam." Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield. Something changed in Robert's expression. The subtle shift that occurs when strangers discover they are connected by invisible threads of shared experience. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the emblem that had been with him through decades of service, through nightmares and recovery, through the long journey that had brought him to this gate with Sadie as his guardian. "I knew Jim," Robert said, his voice roughened by memory. "Good man. Steady hands." The simple assessment contained volumes, the highest praise one pilot could offer another. Whitfield nodded once, emotion briefly tightening his features before his professional mask returned. He turned to the supervisor, who had been watching the exchange with increasing discomfort, weight shifting between polished shoes that suddenly seemed to pinch. "Explain to me," Whitfield said, his tone conversational yet carrying an undercurrent that made the supervisor swallow visibly, "why Mr. Mercer and his service animal are not being permitted to board." The question hung in the air, deceptively simple. Around them, passengers pretended to focus on phones and tablets while straining to catch every word. Sadie remained perfectly positioned beside Robert, her training evident in every line of her attentive posture. The supervisor cleared his throat, producing the tablet that displayed the policy in question. "Sir, our revised service animal policy requires 48-hour advance notification for fully booked flights," and Whitfield raised a hand, silencing the explanation mid-sentence. His eyes never left the tablet, scanning the policy with the efficiency of someone who had likely approved its final version. Robert stood motionless, years of military briefings having taught him the value of patience during chain-of-command discussions. Sadie's ears flicked forward, then back, monitoring the emotional undercurrents flowing around her handler. "This policy," Whitfield said, tapping the screen with a manicured fingernail, "includes a discretionary clause for service animals assisting veterans with PTSD." He looked up, meeting the supervisor's increasingly anxious gaze. Section 4. Paragraph 3. If you'd care to refresh your memory. The terminal's air conditioning created a subtle current around them, carrying the scent of coffee from a nearby kiosk, the antiseptic smell of constantly cleaned surfaces, the faint tang of anxiety now emanating from the airline staff. Robert's hand found the familiar texture of Sadie's fur, an unconscious grounding technique that the dog acknowledged with the slightest lean into his touch. The supervisor scrolled frantically through the document, color rising from his collar as he located the reference clause. "I wasn't aware that is. This discretionary approval requires senior authorization," and Whitfield reached inside his suit jacket, retrieving a business card embossed with the airline logo and his title in raised letters. He placed it on the counter with deliberate precision, aligned perfectly with the edge of the surface. The gate agent stared at it as if it might suddenly take flight, her fingers suspended over the keyboard. "Consider it authorized," Whitfield said simply. He turned back to Robert, his tone shifting subtly, warmth replacing the corporate chill that had silenced the supervisor. "Mr. Mercer, Atlantic Airways would be honored to have you and your service animal on this flight." He reached into his pocket again, producing a small leather folder embossed with gold wings. "This is our chairman's Circle Pass. It ensures that you and Sadie will never face this situation on our airline again." The veteran's eyes widened slightly, recognition of what such a credential represented, not merely priority boarding, but the rarest form of permanent VIP status. Robert's hand trembled slightly as he accepted the folder, decades of stoicism briefly overcome. "Thank you, sir. This is—" he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. Sadie pressed against his leg, sensing the emotional surge. Around them, several passengers had abandoned pretense, openly watching the scene unfold. A woman dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a tissue. A businessman in first-class boarding group stood with ticket, deliberately unscanned, respectfully waiting for the resolution playing out before him. "No thanks necessary," Whitfield replied, his voice pitched for Robert's ears alone. "My father would have expected nothing less." He knelt suddenly, surprising everyone. A CEO in a $1,000 suit, bending to meet Sadie at eye level. The dog maintained her disciplined position, though her intelligent eyes assessed this new human with careful attention. "May I?" Whitfield asked, glancing up at Robert, who nodded permission. The CEO extended his hand, palm up, allowing Sadie to sniff his scent before he gently stroked her head once, with the reverence due to a fellow professional. The boarding announcement chimed again, A musical tone, followed by a voice announcing final call for Atlantic Airways Flight 2743 to Denver. Whitfield rose smoothly, nodding to the gate agent, whose fingers now flew across the keyboard, producing boarding passes with newfound efficiency. "Mr. Mercer and his service animal will be pre-boarding," he instructed, though the words were clearly unnecessary given the agent's frantic compliance. Robert squared his shoulders, military precision returning to his posture as he prepared to move forward. Sadie adjusted seamlessly, positioning herself for the transition through the narrow jetway. "Mr. Whitfield," Robert said, extending his hand once more. The two men shook, a gesture that contained more than social formality, a recognition between them of obligations honored, of promises kept across generations. Jim would be proud. Something flickered in the CEO's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or the momentary vulnerability of a son still seeking his father's approval decades after loss. He nodded once, stepping back to allow Robert and Sadie clear passage to the gate. The veteran moved forward with measured steps, Sadie perfectly aligned with his left leg. Passengers parted before them, some nodding in silent acknowledgement, others smiling openly at the dignified pair. Robert's boots made a familiar rhythm against the floor, the cadence of a man who had marched through far worse challenges than airport terminals. As they approached the jetway entrance, Sadie's tags clinked softly against her collar, a gentle counterpoint to her handler's footsteps. The sound mingled with the hushed appreciation of watching travelers and the quiet whine of anxious paws preparing to guide their partner safely home.